San Francisco. This is Sherman Skolnik, who is a special investigator in Chicago, about the mysterious death of Mrs. E. Howard Hunt, wife of Howard Hunt, convicted Watergate conspirator. And now to continue with Will the Real Conspirators Please Stand Up? The fact sheet presented by Sherman Skolnik, read by Dennis Levitt, KPFK, Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles.
1. The people. Upwards of 12 persons connected in one way or another with Watergate boarded United Airlines Flight 553 on the afternoon of December 8, 1972. They had something in common. That week, there had been a gas pipeline lobbyist meeting as part of the American Bar Association meeting in Washington, D.C. It was conducted by Roger Moreau. His secretary was Nancy Parker. Among those attending were Ralph Blodgett and James Kruger, both of them attorneys for the Northern National Gas Company of Omaha, Nebraska. Associated with them were Lon Bayer, who is an attorney for Kansas-Nebraska Natural Gas Company, Wilbur Erickson, president of the Federal Land Bank in Omaha. This was a belligerent group determined to blow the lid off the Watergate case. The reason? Former U.S. Attorney General John Mitchell and his friends running the Justice Department were putting the spear into Northern Natural Gas. Some officials of that firm and its subsidiaries were indicted on federal criminal charges on September 7, 1972, in Omaha, Chicago, and Hammond, Indiana. The charge? Bribery of local officials in northwest Indiana and Illinois in order to let the gas pipeline go through. This according to the Chicago Daily News of 9/8/72. To blackmail their way out of these charges, the Omaha firm had uncovered documents showing that Mitchell, while he was Attorney General in 1969, dropped antitrust charges against a competitor of Northern Natural Gas. That competitor was El Paso Natural Gas. The dropping of the charges against El Paso was worth some $300 million. A spokesman for Mitchell belatedly claimed in March 73 that Mitchell had disqualified himself in 1969 because Mitchell's law partner represented El Paso. The Justice Department, under Mitchell, dropped the charges. Period. About the same time, Mitchell, through a law partner as nominee, got a stock interest in El Paso. Gas and oil interests such as El Paso, Gulf Resources, and others contributed heavily to Nixon's spy fund. They were supervised by Mitchell. Pipeline official Kruger was carrying the Mitchell documents on the plane. He had told his wife that he had in his possession irreplaceable papers of a sensitive nature. For months after the crash, his widow demanded that United Airlines turn over to her his baggage. It later came out in the pipeline trial in Hammond that Blodgett had been browbeating federal officials to drop the criminal charges just prior to the crash. Dorothy Hunt, Watergate payoff woman who offered executive clemency directly on behalf of Nixon to some of the Watergate defendants, was seeking to leave the United States with over $2 million in cash, as well as negotiables that she had gotten or stolen from the committee to re-elect the president. She and her husband, E. Howard Hunt, the convicted Watergate conspirator, were a CIA couple, two agents married and living together. Early in December 72, both were threatening to blow the lid off the White House if, one, he wasn't freed of the criminal charges, and two, they didn't both get several $1 million. You see, the memo of the Watergate spy, James McCord, before the Irvin Committee outlined some of this. Hunt claimed, according to McCord, to have the data necessary to impeach Nixon. McCord said that matters were coming to a head early in December 72. Mrs. Hunt was unhappy with her job going all over the country to bribe defendants and witnesses in the bugging case. She wanted out. Mrs. Hunt was on her way to arrange to take the money out of the country, possibly Costa Rica, through Harold C. Carlstead, whose wife was Mrs. Hunt's cousin. Carlstead does accounting and tax work for mobster-owned businesses in the Chicago area. He operates 2 Holiday Inn motels in Chicago's south suburbs. Carlstead's motel in Torrance in the south suburb of Chicago is a favorite hangout for gangsters and dope traffickers, such as Cool Freddie Smith, Grover Barnes, and the late Sam DeStefano. These just to name a few. Mrs. Hunt had A, $10,000 in untraceable cash, B, $40,000 in so-called Barker bills, traceable to Watergate spy Bernard Barker, and C, upwards of $2 million in American Express money orders, traveler's checks, and postal money orders. This according to testimony before the NTSB on June 13th and 14th of this year. Carlstead issued a fake cover story that had only $10,000. That story was swallowed by most of the press. Mrs. Hunt got on Flight 553 with Michelle Clark. She was a CBS network newswoman going to do an exclusive story on Watergate, Mrs. Hunt, Mitchell, Nixon. The story could have destroyed Nixon at that time. Mrs. Clark had lots of insight into the bugging and cover-up through her boyfriend, who was a CIA operative. In the summer of '72, prior to any major revelations of Watergate, Ms. Clark tried to pick the brains of Chicago Congressman George Collins, this regarding the bugging of the Democratic headquarters. After the crash, Michelle Clark's employer, CBS Network News, ordered and demanded that her body be cremated, possibly to conceal foul play. Also on the plane were 4 or more people who knew about a labor union that had given a large donation to the committee to re-elect the president to head off an indictment of a Chicago labor hoodlum, a matter which is currently being investigated by the committee. For many years, like clockwork, one Chicagoan went to Washington on Monday and came back Friday afternoon on Flight 553 or its equivalent. He is Lawrence T. O'Connor, apartment 5C, 999 North Lakeshore Drive, Chicago. On Friday, December 8, '72, he received a call from someone he knows in the White House, telling him not to take Flight 553, but to go instead to a special meeting. Also getting on Flight 553 was a hitman pursuing Mrs. Hunt and the others and going under the cover of being a top narcotics official with the Drug Abuse Law Enforcement. He used the name Harold R. Metcalf. He is an unusual narc in that he works directly for Nixon. Metcalf told the pilot he was packing a gun, and so Metcalf was assigned seat 17B, that is near the stewardess's jump seat and also near the food galley in the rear door. After the crash, he walked out of the cracked open fuselage wearing a jumpsuit. A former military intelligence investigator who uses his credentials to get into the crash site identified the person posing as Harold Metcalf as an overseas CIA parachute spy. Also see Metcalf's statement about being a narc and his gun. That's in the NTSB docket SA 435, dated 6/14/73. Metcalf evidently supervised certain foul play, possibly cyanide, directed at certain passengers, but he did not know the overall plan. One of our staff investigators confronted Metcalf about a week after the crash. A. Metcalf, who is supposedly a government narcotics bigshot, knows nothing about dope. B. In response to our question, "Did you know the plane was sabotaged?" he blurted out half a sentence. It was not supposed to be. Turning people, he left the room. Evidently, he has done a double cutout, an espionage term for an operative to be himself eliminated by someone else. His survival was an oversight. 2. The plane. To do a proper job in sabotaging an airplane, you have to know its weaknesses. This particular Boeing 737, number N9031U, had chronic trouble in the month preceding the crash, with its captain's altimeter and its air data computer, 2 of the most important instruments on the plane. The captain's altimeter, for example, must operate at 28 volts DC. An increase in amperage or voltage in the electrical system would cause the instruments to malfunction. The plane was delayed in departure by about 10 to 15 minutes, enough time for a skilled person to strip down the bus bar at a certain point and install a device that shorts out upon descent. The government's own records show the later manifestation of this. In the last 15 minutes of the flight, circuit breakers began popping in the cockpit, causing the tail flight recorder, the air data computer, and other instruments to short out. The transcript of the sole surviving record, the tape of the cockpit voice recorder, shows this from the inter-cockpit discussions. The captain says, quote, "Sounds to me a circuit breaker, perhaps." Then the second officer says, "Ha." An unidentified voice, deleted probably by the FBI according to this report, says something. Then the captain said, "Yeah, I just meant, I thought you'd better check everything, ah." The cockpit voice recorder, when found, was turned over to the FBI. Flight 553 needed its instruments. Visibility was 1 to 2 miles. Ceiling varied from 400 to some 1,000 feet, with low enough clouds coming down to 100 feet. As for the National Weather Service, they say that the runway visual range recorder was not working. A major radio navigational instrument is the airport outer marker, also called by the street name it's on. A outer marker at Midway Airport is in the vicinity of 87th and Kedzie, and is called by some the Kedzie localizer. The Midway Airport outer marker stopped working as Flight 553 approached it. The captain said, quote, "Is Kedzie localizer off the air, is that it?" And then referring to an inbound on runway number 31 left, he saw a propeller-driven plane coming in ahead of them on the same runway. Propeller planes, though, are supposed to land on 31 right. The captain's altimeter would not work below 3,400 feet. An aviation expert saw flight number 553 at about 450 feet near 73rd and Kedzie, this to the far right of the corner on the outer marker. The NTSB tried to conceal this data by improper questions of their witness, William Simone, who later became a witness for this committee. Some of the intentional blunders on the ground are, A, in the last 15 minutes of Flight 553, its speed was erratic. It was being watched by some of the most highly sophisticated radar equipment and computers in the world, yet, although they claimed they were told to slow down, after 23 sweeps of the radar, the plane was still going 210 knots per hour, and it was being watched by the Chicago Airport Control at O'Hare Airport. Another interesting point brought out in this is cyanide. The pilot, prophetically named Captain Whitehouse, and 6 of the Watergate passengers had a very high cyanide content, higher than they could have gotten from a so-called aircraft cabin fire. Captain Whitehouse had 4 times as much as necessary to kill him. That's 3.9 micrograms per milliliter, according to one of the exhibits at the hearing. Michelle Clark's employer, CBS Network News, wanted immediate cremation of her body. Foul play is evident, since how else were these people singled out for cyanide of the 43 that died in the crash? Remember, hitman Harold Metcalf was sitting near the food galley. Section 9, the FBI. After the crash, we made public statements about 200 FBI and DIA people refusing to show their credentials and having taken over the crash site coincident with the crash or just shortly before. We were called liar. Then, on June 13, 1973, Chairman John Reed of the National Transportation Safety Board told the House Government Activities Subcommittee that he sent a letter to the FBI that, A, never in living memory had the FBI acted as in the Flight 553 crash. Reed said that 50 FBI agents came into the crash zone shortly after the crash. B, one FBI agent proceeded into Midway Control Tower and took over the tape relating to Flight 553 without asking permission. And C, before the NTSB investigators could do so, the FBI conducted 26 interviews, including the surviving flight attendants. The FBI interviews were completed within 20 hours of the crash. Section 11, the cover-up. Note this chronology. A, December 9, 1972, one day after the crash, White House aide Eagle Crow, Jr., also involved in the Ellsberg burglary caper, was appointed Undersecretary of Transportation, supervising the National Transportation Safety Board and the Federal Aviation Administration. They are the 2 agencies supposedly going to investigate the crash of Flight 553. B, December 19, 1972, White House Deputy Assistant to Nixon and Secretary to the Cabinet Alexander Butterfield is appointed the new head of the FAA. Butterfield, who was an Air Force officer for 20 years, was also a CIA aviation liaison. See, for example, Jack Anderson's column in the Chicago Daily News of 5/8/73. C, Dwight Chapin, Nixon's appointment secretary and mentioned in the Watergate scandal, becomes 5 weeks after the crash a top executive with United Airlines at their home office in Chicago. Chapin had no previous business experience. At the original crash hearings in February 73, he threatened media people with reprisals if they mentioned sabotage, reprisals such as using Clay Whitehead, Nixon's communications czar, to seek the breakup of the networks on antitrust charges. D, even before the crash, Herbert Kalmbach, Nixon's personal attorney, has been the lawyer for United Airlines and Marriott Corporation, which has an airplane and flight food service for airlines. A 12th point, the original National Transportation Safety Board hearings on the crash started February 73. When they refused the documentation of this committee and testimony regarding sabotage and robbery, we sued them. The upshot was a reopened hearings in June of 73, when Skolnik produced over 1,300 pages of documentation and 5 witnesses. The 13th point concerns the media. The establishment media has lied about the crash of Flight 553 from the beginning. Several of the establishment papers, radio, and TV told a monstrous lie that we had no documentation at the reopened hearings. Some smaller radio and TV stations have presented a far more fairer presentation. Point 14 is who, the highest level of the federal government, including Nixon, had an interest in the murder of Mrs. E. Howard Hunt and the other Watergate people on the plane. His strikes force tried to sabotage their own case against the Cirelli airplane robbery gang because it involved Watergate. The establishment media, interlocked financially with United Airlines, has so far not told the truth about Flight 553. We've been reading from a fact sheet produced and circulated by the Citizens Committee to Clean Up the Courts. Chairman is Sherman Skolnik of Chicago. He is known for the fact that he is one of the first ones who investigated Otto Kerner. Otto Kerner, you'll remember, used to be the governor of Illinois, as well as a federal court judge. He is now behind bars, having been convicted on 18 counts of perjury, fraud, and other charges. We're speaking with Sherman Skolnik, the chairman of the Citizens Committee to Clean Up the Courts. Beginning, Mr. Skolnik, can you give us a brief history of the Citizens Committee, why it was founded, and maybe some of the investigations you've been instrumental in?
Been active in combating, researching, and investigating corruption in the Middle West in particular. Our work is fairly well known, at least in this area. We uncovered the information that forced the government to indict Kerner. They had to, after what we dug up. The State Supreme Court of Illinois, half of them resigned after our disclosures 4 years ago. The Chief Deputy Clerk of the Federal Court in Chicago got 10 years in jail based on our disclosures. So we've been active in this field of research and investigation for 10 years or more. Midway plane crash occurred last December 8th. In the beginning, it wasn't of interest to us. However, we developed an informant within the FAA, and that informant told us that we ought to be interested because the people on the plane, there was a dozen people connected to Watergate. In the beginning, we thought it was only Mrs. Hunt, and they were murdered by way of this crash to silence them and also to give the opportunity to steal from their possession certain documents and valuables that Nixon and the Committee to Re-elect the President did not want circulating around. And from that point forward, we began developing information. We were opposed, I would say, every step of the way by the news media. I'm very knowledgeable about the media. I'm a former news media teacher. I used to teach at a small college in Chicago. Many of my former students are scattered throughout broadcasting and publishing throughout the country. I realized that with United Airlines, the operator of the plane, we're going to get a lot of static, and we did. There's a lot of space been devoted in some newspapers to putting us down. The Chicago Tribune, for example, and the Washington Post have both published the most fraudulent stories I've ever seen, namely that we have no documentation, when in fact on June 13th and 14th, the hearings were reopened of the National Transportation Safety Board. They were reopened especially for our presentation. We presented over 1,300 documents and 5 witnesses, which made a very substantial case with evidence that the plane was not an accident and that there were massive failures both on the ground and in the cockpit of the plane, which we point by point over a 2-day period of hearings pointed out. It was such an overkill it could not have been an accident. The major radio navigational beam failed. Major weather instruments suddenly failed on that day. The major instruments in the cockpit failed as the plane approached the airport. 6 of the Watergate people on the plane had high content of cyanide, higher than they could have gotten from a fire, and so on. A whole hundreds of documented facts which the government has tried to wiggle out of and which the news media has tried to ignore.
Now, why do you feel that the news media has ignored this? Because much of the information which you've uncovered has been, so to speak, public.
To me, as a former news media teacher, it may not be evident to some of your listeners. The news media, ABC, CBS, and NBC, are interlocked financially with the major airlines. United Airlines is owned by the Chase Manhattan Bank of New York. The bank itself is owned by the Rockefeller family and Senator Charles Percy of Illinois. These are some of the most powerful people in the United States. In turn, United Airlines is financially interlocked with the Washington Post and Newsweek. So we have the most massive opposition. If we're right, some awfully big people are wrong, and they're not going to permit a discussion of it. And so only smaller radio and TV stations and some smaller newspapers dealt with this subject at all. I'd point out to you that shortly after I was on a TV station in Los Angeles, KHJ-TV, Stan Borman was fired practically right on the spot for interviewing me about the Midway crash. There is tremendous opposition to the facts being related about the Midway crash and about the 12 people on the plane connected to Watergate.
Have you tried to present your information to the Senate Watergate Committee?
Yes, we have. I have a letter in our possession signed by Senator Sam Ervin, the chairman of the committee. He says that the subject matter of the death of Mrs. Hunt, who died on that plane, is not within his interest. I find it monstrous for him to send such a letter. However, if he says it's not within his interest, I must accept his letter at face value.
What about with today's testimony by Tony Olashewitz that he described giving money to Mrs. E. Howard Hunt? What do you make of this?
I would say that the Select Committee, the Watergate Committee, is skirting the issue. There are several committees of Congress and the Senate who have interviewed me at length, who have talked to our staff at length. They have seen our documentation. They know that we stole the documents from the government's files They know that the safety board is up the wall about our disclosures, and yet the select committee will not do anything. Maybe in time they will sniff around the edges of the Watergate plane crash, but to this time I don't think they're that interested. They have told me in writing, they've told me on the phone. I have to accept for the moment what they say.
Now, a plane crash involving the death of over 40 people, while it's certainly not on the scale of the death of Indochina, is certainly one would think of interest to a lot of people. Why hasn't the Senate committee opened this up? Do you think there are reasons?
Well, because their thing is only investigating Nixon or around the edges of Nixon in respect to nonviolent situations, bugging and break-in. We directly accuse the highest level of the government, including the president, of murder. Mrs. Hunt was about to put the finger directly upon Nixon. Her and her husband had information to impeach the president. They had both been blackmailing the president. On the Watergate plane were carried over $2 million that they had blackmailed out of the committee to re-elect the president. That has fallen into the hands of some gangsters that specialize in airplane crimes, and we know a great deal about it, and Howard Hunt, at this point, only wants more money. He evidently does not want to do anything about his wife, Dorothy.
Now, it would seem to me that if they wanted to kill Mrs. E. Howard Hunt and possibly Michelle Clark and a few others, that it would be easier to do it when they weren't on an airplane and causing the death of over 40 people.
No, I disagree. It's 7 months later, and the only ones that really and truly understand what we're talking about from a technical standpoint, about the instruments, about the ground controllers being part of this and how they were part of it, are only other aviation people. The general public looks at it and they do not know what it means when we say that the 24-hour-a-day outer marker, major radio navigational instrument at Midway Airport, failed only as this plane approached it and then went back on the air as it left. Now that is important to people that fly, it's important to pilots, but it does not necessarily ring a bell with the public.
Now, you wrote about a certain Lawrence O'Connor, who normally flew Flight 553, but he didn't take the flight that night because of a phone call from the White House.
That's true. We said that to the safety board. We say it publicly. We know of a man that took that same plane every Friday afternoon for more than a dozen years in return from Washington. He had business every week in Washington, and he took that plane or its equivalent, except on December 8th, when he received a call from a friend in the White House who says, do not take 553, stay over, or you have to come to a special meeting.
Who is Lawrence O'Connor, and how do you know that he received that phone call?
Sir, we have interviewed a great number of people about that. That point is no longer a dispute or a question. It's an accepted fact. His neighbors in the building where he lives knows the man. They know he's been traveling that same route for a dozen years. He mentioned it to a close friend of his, and from that information we compiled a great deal. It would take another half an hour to tell what all we know about the man. He's rather a sort of a mysterious businessman that has White House connections.
I see. Thank you very much for talking with me.
Listening to a special report on the mysterious death of Mrs. E. Howard Hunt by Sherman Skolnik. The interviewer was Dennis Levitt of KPFK Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles. We should point out that much of Mr. Skolnik's evidence is unsubstantiated, and for a special report on that subject, you should listen to KPFA on September 4th at 9 p.m. for a documentary on the Midway plane crash. Was it a conspiracy?
Ladies and gentlemen, United Airlines Flight 553 from Washington's National Airport will land at Chicago's Midway Airport in 2 minutes. Please extinguish all cigarettes and bring your chairs to the full upright position.
of daily revelations of bribery, forgery, burglary, and the destruction of government documents by those implicated in the Watergate conspiracy, the American public has learned to expect anything in the next day's newspaper headlines. But a Chicago-based organization has made the most serious charges so far, accusing high government officials of murder, sabotage, and robbery in connection with the Midway plane crash of December 8th. The plane, a Boeing 737, United Airlines Flight 553, en route from Washington's National Airport to Chicago's Midway Airport on Friday, December 8th at 2:27 p.m., circled for a landing but never made it, striking a high-tension line and plowing into a row of houses about a mile from the airport. 45 persons were killed, including Mrs. Dorothy Hunt, wife of the since-convicted Watergate conspirator E. Howard Hunt, and herself the payoff woman for hush money to the Watergate defendants, CBS News correspondent Michelle Clark, Ralph Blodgett and James Kruger, two gas pipeline attorneys allegedly carrying documents linking a gas pipeline case with the Watergate, and two unidentified gas pipeline lobbyists. Sherman Skolnik, the man who framed the Midway conspiracy theory, is a self-styled investigator and the founder and chairman of a 10-year-old nonprofit Chicago organization called the Citizens Committee to Clean Up the Courts. With a staff of 36 unpaid investigators and an army of informants, Skolnik is generally credited with having forced the resignation of two Illinois Supreme Court judges and convicting federal appeals court judge and former Illinois Governor Otto Kerner for bribery, mail fraud, extortion, perjury, and tax evasion. But the prevalent attitude among lawyers, prosecutors, and reporters is that his investigative techniques are more than questionable and that he's wrong more often than right. He, in turn, has charged the press and the Federal Aviation Administration with an attempted cover-up of the murder-sabotage conspiracy. At any rate, the government has still not conceded a trace of truth to his charges. An official of the National Transportation and Safety Board, the agency charged with investigating air crashes, said flatly that the crash was the result of pilot error and there was no evidence of sabotage. But there are many events surrounding the crash of Flight 553 which are too striking to pass over. I'm Jan Lagnito, and for the next hour or so, we'll take a look at the Midway plane crash to see if it was coincidence or conspiracy.
On the afternoon of December 8th, the plane was en route from Washington to Chicago. The plane, as it approached Midway Airport, was 200 feet too low. I should point out that we have developed informants within the FAA, who at the risk of their neck have told us a great deal. We know that there was a pinhole in the altimeter. We know that the pilot was believed to have died before the crash. There is now a dispute between the FAA and the Cook County coroner. A pathologist in the Cook County coroner's office contends that the autopsy dealt with by him shows, using, he claims, the latest methods, shows that the pilot was dead prior to the crash. The pilot, by the way, had an interesting name, Captain Wendell Whitehouse, perhaps a very prophetic name. Of the three people that died in the cockpit, Captain Whitehouse, according to the government's own documents, was the only one with a cyanide level. Of the some 45 people that died in the crash, only what we feel are the important people on the plane had cyanide. Now, if there was an aircraft cabin fire due to plastics burning, then by random selection, there would be various people who died in the crash whose bodies would show cyanide if that is what they got from the plane crash fire. Oddly enough, it was only the pilot and the 6 passengers that I have mentioned, Mrs. Hunt, Michelle Clark, the 2 gas pipeline attorneys, Mr. Blodgett and Mr. Kruger, and 2 gas pipeline lobbyists that had the cyanide level. We took this matter up with a very prominent toxicologist who we feel could be impartial in this matter. He looked at the statistics and he says, well, now this pilot has 9 whiffs too many. I says, well, what does that mean in layman's language? He said, well, 1 whiff would have been enough to stop his lungs from functioning. I said, well, how did he get the other 9 whiffs? And the toxicologist told us that he got it from either ingestion or injection.
However, the Cook County Coroner's Office has a very different story. Edward Shalgus, the pathologist who performed the autopsy, insisted that Captain Whitehouse's blood had carbon monoxide in it, indicating that he was alive and in good condition at the time of the crash, and in fact lived for a long time afterwards trapped in the cabin. Shalgus and other pathologists have pointed out that cyanide poisoning is caused by combustion of plastic products, in this case the interior of the plane, which produces cyanide gas. He indicated that Captain Whitehouse's death was definitely related to inhalation leading to carbon monoxide asphyxiation and blood cyanide accumulation. Autopsies were not performed on the 2 other members of the flight crew, since the co-pilot was dismembered by the crash and the flight engineer could not be identified. Skolnik also charged that abnormally large traces of cyanide were found in the bodies of the 6 Watergate people. But the National Transportation Safety Board's report indicates quite the opposite, that none of the first-class passengers, including Dorothy Hunt, James Kruger, and Ralph Blodgett, died of cyanide asphyxiation, but rather from a combination of burns, lacerations, internal injuries, and carbon monoxide asphyxiation, which also killed all but 3 of the passengers. The remaining 3 did show traces of cyanide asphyxia, but there is no indication that they were in any way connected with Watergate.
We know this, that on this plane was sitting a very odd person who survived the plane crash by the name of Harold Metcalf. He was sitting in the jump seat next to the food galley in the rear of the plane, seat B-17. By the way, we confronted him a week after the crash with the showing of what we knew at that time, that there was sabotage involved in this plane. He was almost freaked out because, as we later discovered from talking to him and from piecing together other information, that he is what is known in espionage as a double cutout. In other words, his job was to deal with the passengers. From his standpoint, supposedly the passengers that he dealt with would die in the airport terminal after the plane landed. He evidently did not know that there was another group involved in the plane that would deal with the plane and put the plane down. So he survived the crash and he is nearly freaked out. We again confronted him after he got off the witness stand when he testified during the crash investigation in February. I asked him, I said, Mr. Metcalf, will you allow the thought to cross your mind that there was sabotage involved in this plane? He nearly freaked out again. He began screaming at me in the lobby of the crash investigation. There is another way that it is quite simple to doctor up a person's meal on a plane. By the way, oddly enough, this plane was having lunch served as it was about to land, which is not the customary procedure. The in-flight services that prepare food for planes often use day labor. Any person can walk in there at the drop of a hat and suddenly begin preparing food. Furthermore, they have a sloppy method. Any person, without really identifying himself, merely saying that he is Mr. This or Mrs. That, can call up and say, I'm a passenger on flight 553, and I'm a diabetic, a vegetarian, or some other medical problem, and I require a special diet. That special diet will then catch up with that person on the plane, and the diet may look the same as the other food, but in fact be part of a situation of foul play.
It is true that Harold Metcalf, a bona fide agent of the Office of Drug Abuse and Law Enforcement who testified at the first Safety Board hearing, was sitting in seat 17B next to the food galley. But according to the stewardess in that area, 17B was not the jump seat. Just what Mr. Metcalf was doing on board Flight 553 is not known, but there's not a shred of evidence which points to Skolnik's elaborate selective poisoning plot. What's more, several prominent toxicologists, whose identity is known, insist that cyanide poisoning by injection or ingestion could not be so precisely timed as to take effect only minutes before the crash.
Every plane is required to carry 2 flight recorders, as was this plane. The recorders are designed to survive a possible crash and to be almost bomb-proof. In respect to Flight 553, both recorders were really unavailable for use by any crash investigation. One recorder in the cockpit stopped functioning in a rare malfunction 14 minutes before the crash. The housing of the recorder was disassembled and long bolts removed, which is almost impossible to happen by accident. The recorder in the tail disappeared. The tail fell off the plane intact into the streets. It was almost not damaged. That recorder disappeared and showed up shortly before the crash with most of it blank. We feel that this is not statistically possible, that both flight recorders should end up in this way.
Skolnik refused to reveal the identity of the anonymous FAA informant who told him that Flight 553 was sabotaged by air traffic controllers who misdirected the plane, supposedly already crippled by manipulated malfunctions. As for his claim that the captain's altimeter had been tampered with, William Lamb, the chief investigator of the crash for the Safety Board, says that the captain's altimeter was relatively undamaged by the crash and was found to be working perfectly. The co-pilot's altimeter was too badly damaged to be tested fully for defects. But according to Captain John R. McDonald, a veteran accident investigator for the Airline Pilots Association, who testified at the hearings, had there been a massive electrical failure, the cockpit voice recorder transcript would not have been available for examination by Skolnik or anyone else to interpret.
Coincident, almost simultaneous with the crash zone was taken over by some 200 plainclothes people in about 100 or more unmarked cars. Police that we interviewed in the area said that they were pushed out of the area. Now, the reason this is strange is the nearest federal facility, the federal building downtown Chicago, is some 12 to 14 miles from the crash zone. The FAA headquarters in the northwest suburbs are upwards of 25 to 30 miles. The police stations are only a minute or two away from the crash zone. And yet, these plainclothes people, who apparently did not wish to even show their credentials, took over the entire crash zone almost simultaneous with the crash. How did they get there that quickly? Why did they push the police out of the area? There is a presumption that they were going to take Mrs. Hunt into custody with or without a crash. In any case, it's odd that they came there that quickly before the police and took over the crash zone.
The most ominous evidence to support Skolnik's conspiracy theory revolves around the arrival of 50 FBI agents at the crash zone minutes before the crash. Gene Bludeau, a Chicago UPI reporter, indicated that he arrived at the site 40 minutes after the crash and saw numerous FBI agents in the area, but remarked that it was not an unusual occurrence. Later this year, Texas Congressman Jack Brooks' Subcommittee on Governmental Activities made further queries and learned from the National Transportation Safety Board and the FBI that fewer than a dozen Bureau agents had assisted the board at the crash site. Then, in a striking reversal in July of this year, the FBI and the Safety Board confirmed Skolnik's allegations that 50 agents had stormed the crash zone, shoving aside local Chicago police, questioning airport employees, and examining the wreckage. While continuing with his investigation, Brooks' subcommittee noted that the incident marked the first time in U.S. crash disaster history that the FBI had overstepped its authority, taking over a crash investigation without the permission of the Safety Board. At the very least, the incident reveals that the FBI was aware of Mrs. Hunt's presence on board Flight 553 and was monitoring her activities.
Now, as to Mrs. Hunt, she was carrying with her the following: $50,000. $10,000 has been described to the media, and the media bought that story and used it. Those were untraceable bills. An additional $40,000 was carried by her in what is known as the Barker money, bills with consecutive numbers traceable to the Watergate. Over and above that, she had upwards of $2 million in American Express money orders made out to cash to the amount of $100 each.
Dorothy Hunt remains the most mysterious missing link in the chain connecting the White House to payoffs to silence the Watergate defendants. What we do know is that she was the wife of former CIA agent and convicted Watergate conspirator E. Howard Hunt, that she took out $250,000 in flight insurance prior to boarding Flight 553, and that she was found dead at the crash site with $10,585 in untraceable $100 bills. She was supposedly taking the money to Chicago to invest in a motel, but press stories indicate several other possibilities: that the $10,000 was hush money to the Watergate defendants, or to Mrs. Hunt herself, or, as the Chicago Tribune reported, final payment on electronics equipment. While there's no evidence to support Skolnik's claim that Mrs. Hunt stole $2 million from the committee to re-elect the president, we do know that blackmail was taking place. New York policeman Anthony Ulasewicz told the Watergate Committee in July that he had secretly passed money to Mrs. Hunt through a complicated, precision-timed scheme that involved hiding airport locker keys in telephone booths. He said that Mrs. Hunt, who mentioned that she had lost her job as a result of Watergate, tried to blackmail the White House to the tune of $450,000 and managed to get $154,000 from Nixon's lawyer, Herbert Kalmbach. And in a memo that James McCord filed with the Senate Watergate Committee, he said, quote, "Hunt purportedly threatened to blow the White House out of the water. Mrs. Hunt, at that point in her conversation with me, also repeated the statement which she too had made before, which was that E. Howard Hunt had information which could impeach the president," unquote. 3 months after blackmailing the White House and 3 hours after boarding Flight 553, Dorothy Hunt was a mystery. Dead in the plane wreckage, her husband in jail, and her children heir to $250,000 in flight insurance.
The 2 gas pipeline lawyers were warned in Washington that they would never live to get to Chicago. They were part of a group of 9 pipeline lawyers representing the Northern Natural Gas Company of Omaha. Now, the officials of that company have been, since September of 1972, under federal criminal indictment in Hammond, Indiana, Chicago, Illinois, and Omaha, Nebraska. The major competitor of that company is the El Paso Natural Gas Company. In 1969, while John Mitchell was the U.S. Attorney General, the Justice Department dropped antitrust charges against El Paso. About that same time, by way of a nominee, John Mitchell got a stock interest in that company. When we first made that charge in court in March of 1972, a few weeks later, for the first time that we have heard of, a Mr. Horace Webb of the Justice Department said that Mitchell, 4 years previous, had disqualified himself from the El Paso natural gas case because a law partner of Mitchell's had been an attorney for El Paso. The attorneys for the Omaha company were carrying documents which we had previously known about to be used to blackmail the Justice Department to drop the federal criminal charges. The El Paso stock transfer list, copies of which they carried with them on the plane, could be used to show that the former Attorney General, and therefore friends of his in the Justice Department, had a serious conflict of interest regarding a $300 million case. It was just recently that the High Court in Washington reversed the situation and reinstated the antitrust charges. In effect, what happened in '69 was that the Justice Department had won the case on a lower level in the court system, and El Paso was appealing the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. The effect was that the Justice Department was confessing error, as it is known, and so they torpedoed the case and allowed El Paso to go free. Mitchell, as it has been pointed out by the Washington Post and other papers, was in charge of a $305,000 espionage fund contained within the Watergate money, contributions of which were made to that fund by gas and oil companies. One company has already been identified, Gulf Resources. Another company that would have been identified would have been El Paso Natural Gas. That was contained within the documents in the possession of the two gas pipeline attorneys. In effect, they were saying, look, if you're going to burn some of our people, according to these documents, we're going to release this information to burn your people.
It is a matter of record that in 1969, antitrust charges were pending against El Paso in connection with the construction of a pipeline to the Pacific Northwest. As Skolnik pointed out, because his law firm had represented El Paso, Mitchell disqualified himself from ruling on the case. Then Deputy Attorney General Richard Kleindienst decided to drop the action against El Paso, the point at which Mitchell allegedly acquired his interest in that company. But the suit was subsequently reinstated by the Supreme Court. Skolnik's claim that Blodgett and Kruger were using the documents to blackmail Mitchell and the Justice Department into dropping the charges against Northern and its subsidiaries has not been substantiated, since he refuses to produce the stock transfer lists in question, which he says are still in his possession somewhere out of the country.
Now, as to how we became, as a group, so privy to the information involving this crash, it just so happens that one of our volunteer staff investigators, Alex J. Bottas of Gary, Indiana, infiltrated an airplane robbery gang known as the Joseph Cirelli Mob. They were arrested 5 weeks after the Midway crash, charged with an offense committed by them in flight in another plane last August. The Cirelli Mob, the airplane robbery gang, was divided up into two basic functions. They had former aircraft technicians and fences. The technicians would, with the most sophisticated methods, steal in flight from airplanes negotiable securities, bonds, and money from baggage compartments. Just to show how skilled they are, in the matter for which they have been charged and arrested in January of 1973, they robbed a plane from Chicago to Milwaukee, which is in the air less than an hour. One of these former aircraft technicians got into the washroom. He had a special key that only an insider would know about or have, which opened a compartment, little known to laymen, a compartment between the toilet and the baggage compartment, and he reached right in and took out a sack of over $2 million in negotiable bonds and securities. Now, being an aircraft technician and an insider, He knew that the Armored Express, or Brinks, was inclined to put their negotiable security sacks up against that wall in the toilet, so that when the plane landed, he simply got out of the washroom and left. His accomplice, of course, told the stewardess that his friend was in the washroom vomiting and was ill. When the stewardess got into the washroom, there was nothing left by way of any evidence to show anything. The Cirelli gang were arrested on a criminal information brought before a U.S. magistrate, Baylog, in the federal court system in Chicago on the 24th floor of the federal building in Chicago. Now, our staff investigator had infiltrated the workings of the Cirelli mob. He was to have been kept anonymous. Yet there is an affidavit in the federal court records that I mentioned by a special agent of the FBI, John Dolan, which identified for the first time our investigator, Alex Bottas. The prosecution was brought not by the local U.S. attorney, but by the elite prosecutors of the federal government, known as the Strike Force, or the National Strike Force, headquartered in Chicago and headed up by Sheldon Davidson and Douglas Roller. Their phone numbers, by the way, in Chicago are area code 312-353-5269 and 353-5348. Douglas Roller brought the Cirelli mob prosecution. When they discovered that the Cirelli case involved more than the Milwaukee plane ripoff, that it in fact involved the murder and sabotage and robbery of the Flight 553 carrying Mrs. Hunt and others, it was at that point that the strike force did not want to proceed. They obstructed, in fact, their own case because their own documents filed in court show that Alex Bottas was a star witness in this case. The case hinged upon it. They allowed, permitted, and condoned that another federal prosecutor send Alex Bottas away for so-called mental observation without any written proof or written charge, without any trial or any hearing. Now, to those that think that this is quite unconstitutional, I agree. On April 9th of 73, Jack Anderson, in his column, pointed out, without mentioning Bottas, that there is a place in Springfield, Missouri, for keeping political prisoners, known as the Federal Prison Hospital there. It was in that place that Alex Bottas was kept. It was in that same place, by the way, that black Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden was kept. He was the one that tried to tell the Warren Commission that there was a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy involving the CIA, and that this plan was to have gone into effect 3 weeks before Dallas. Within 1 day that Mr. Bolden tried to bring this before the Warren Commission, he was on the way to being framed by perjured testimony and sent to the so-called Federal Prison Hospital, which is a place really of total and maximum security.
Bottas, an ex-Marine who served time in Korea, last year did some informing for the Chicago Strike Force, which was after the Joseph Cirelli Mob for the theft of $2.1 million in securities stolen off a Northern Central Airlines Chicago to Milwaukee flight in August of 1972. Posing as a fence under the name of Alex Doyle, Bottas allegedly infiltrated the Cirelli gang, saw the Northern Central securities, and also got a glimpse of money orders and pipeline documents that he figured out could only have come from Flight 553. On March 5th, Alex Bottas was actually arrested by Gary, Indiana policemen on a charge of impersonating an FBI agent and turned over to federal authorities, who took him to a federal hospital in Springfield, Missouri. There he underwent examination for delusions and acute paranoia and was released 40 days later on April 20th with a clean bill of health. Along with Skolnik and the Cirelli Mob, Bottas, who had previously been convicted of impersonating a police officer, is the only one who has so far seen the stolen pipeline documents. Needless to say, Skolnik is a staunch advocate of conspiracy theories in the death of John F. Kennedy. He's charged the FBI, the Secret Service, and Chicago officials with a conspiracy to kill Kennedy on an aborted trip to Chicago in early November 1973. He's also filed suit, so far unsuccessfully, to force the National Archives to release documentation which he says would prove his thesis.
Now, we attempted to bring this information at a public hearing conducted by Isabel Burgess as the chairman of the Board of Inquiry of the National Transportation Safety Board of the FAA. The hearings began February 27, 1973, supposedly to inquire into the Midway crash. The hearings were dominated by very high-class attorneys and talent from United Airlines, the operator of Flight 553, Pratt & Whitney, the manufacturers of the engines, Boeing, the maker of the airplane, and other persons that had an interest in it. In fact, there were a great crowd of civil liability lawyers who certainly would not want to hear the word sabotage mentioned, because they were busy taking notes to see what further evidence they could find of negligence. They were in the audience, these civil liability lawyers, representing various claimants, witnesses and survivors and widows and so on, of those that were victims on Flight 553. In fact, some of those civil liability lawyers attempted to take me to lunch and persuade us not to continue making statements in the lobby of the hearings about sabotage. The government found out for the first time that Alex Batos was in fact connected with the Citizens Committee to clean up the courts, because he and I sat together at the crash investigation. We talked to reporters who somehow did not use it on the air. From my knowledge as a news media teacher, I knew that United Airlines was using their advertising power to keep this off the air. When our testimony was refused by the board chairman of this investigation, who I personally sought out and delivered a letter to in the lobby on March 1st, 73, we had no choice but to bring a civil suit against her for holding a public hearing where our documentation, witnesses, and testimony respecting what we contend is murder and sabotage regarding the Midway crash, that information was not allowed to be brought into the public hearing. On March 2nd, 1973, we had a summons served on Miss Burgess by a Cook County deputy sheriff. The attorney, Mr. Stoldryer of the Board of Inquiry, came out in the hall and tried to negotiate with me. I told him that the case was not for sale. He said they did not wish to proceed to any hearing or trial or defense of the case. I said, well, I'm a layman representing myself. I'm not about to tell you how to defend against our case. He said, well, we do not wish to proceed with the case. Within one business day of the case being filed on Friday, March 2nd, Alex Batos was in custody by the federal marshals. No written charges, no hearing, no trial. And he was kept there for 40 days. It was only through the help and assistance of a local crime commission, the operating director of the Northwest Indiana Crime Commission, who was also involved in the Cirelli airplane robbery gang case, that we were able to get Alex Batos released. On April 20th, 1973, Alex Batos was released to the operating director of the Crime Commission, Elmer Jacobson. There was a finding by a staff psychiatrist that there was nothing wrong with Alex Batos. which meant that the whole thing of sending him was to take away the star witness in the Cirelli case involving the Midway crash, as well as other cases involving in-flight offenses. On Monday, April 23rd, 1973, there was a rare public press conference by the Northwest Indiana Crime Commission where they publicly accused the strike force and Douglas Roller of fraud and connivance in respect to having their star witness, Alex Batos, taken away fraudulently and falsely for so-called mental observation. In other words, various federal agencies tried to obstruct the Joseph Cirelli case, and we challenge the government now. Why have they not proceeded with the prosecution of the Joseph Cirelli mob? Was it because they found out after arresting the Cirelli mob in January of 73 that the case also involved the Midway crash and the Watergate? As to the crash itself, we must add the fact that we have a star witness that a parachute, a package parachute, came out of the baggage compartment, not a person, but a package, before the crash. Now, the Cirelli mob has operated for more than 10 years without getting caught, and they have the most sophisticated methods of robbing planes.
The Cirelli mob was arrested 5 weeks after the Midway plane crash for the August 1972 robbery aboard Northern Central Airlines, and it's unclear whether they've been prosecuted for that offense. But if you're wondering how they smuggled Mrs. Hunt's stolen $2 million out of an airplane that was about to crash in flames and be encircled by 50 FBI agents, Skolnik has the answer. A small ball of tinfoil with a parachute attached, thrown out of a private plane to screw up the radar screen, while the real thing was dropped out of Flight 553. Unfortunately, every pilot questioned does not agree. They all say that when an exit to a plane is opened in flight, there is decompression in the cabin that produces a tremendous swoosh of air. This would be noticed by passengers and would also show up in the recording of cockpit conversations. And none of the survivors of the crash reported hearing or seeing anything unusual until the plane had also crashed.
About 5 or 6 weeks after the crash near Midway Airport, Nixon's appointment secretary, who has been linked to the Watergate, Dwight L. Chapin, made a statement that if he is not granted executive privilege and called to testify, he will so-called blow the whistle. Thereafter, he left the White House, and about 5 or 6 weeks after the Midway crash, in other words, 5 or 6 weeks after December 8th, 1972, where does Dwight Chapin show up? Why, he shows up as a top executive for United Airlines, whose headquarters is in Chicago. We believe that Dwight Chapin had something to do with the controlling of the press image and press relations regarding the crash investigation of the Midway crash. The crash investigation, of course, started February 27, 1973. We believe that there is a link between Dwight Chapin, linked to the Watergate, being then linked to United Airlines. We know from reading Fletcher Prouty's book, The Secret Team, that the Central Intelligence Agency has infiltrated the work of the FAA. As to the crash investigation itself, the number one witness for the government was something that interested us a great deal. Here was a gentleman whose work required him to be outdoors on the street measuring asphalt right under the flight path of Flight 553. A Mr. Simonini, working as an asphalt paving salesman, measured the parking lot paving at the Nabisco factory at 73rd and Kedzie on the southwest side of Chicago, directly under the flight path of the airplane. His work required him to be outdoors. Oddly enough, he was outdoors from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock that day, and the crash was about halfway into that 1 hour period. It so happens that Mr. Simonini is a retired FAA inspector with 5,000 hours of flight time. Here is what we feel is a clincher. Mr. Simonini works for a subsidiary of El Paso Natural Gas, involved in this plane crash by the way of those documents. We interviewed Mr. Simonini for hours after his testimony on the witness stand. He could not explain how it was that he got to that place. We believe, however, that Mr. Simonini himself does not know how he got there and is probably telling the truth. Somebody probably in his office steered him there.
While it's a little naive to believe that the advertising power of one airline could suppress a conspiracy story, the transfer of various Nixon administration officials to key FAA and United Airlines positions following the Midway crash does bear examination. On December 9, 1972, one day after the crash, White House aide Eagle Crow, who was later forced to resign because of his involvement in the break-in of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, was appointed Undersecretary of Transportation. His duties included supervising the National Transportation Safety Board and the Federal Aviation Administration, the two agencies investigating the crash of Flight 553. On December 19, 1972, White House Deputy Assistant to Nixon and Secretary to the Cabinet, Alexander Butterfield, was appointed the new head of the Federal Aviation Administration. Butterfield, you may remember, was the former aide to H.R. Haldeman, who in July testified before the Senate Watergate Committee that Nixon had ordered the Secret Service to install devices to record conversations in the Oval Office. And even before the crash, Herbert Kalmbach, President Nixon's personal attorney, had been the lawyer for United Airlines and Marriott Corporation, which has an airplane in-flight food service for airlines.
Now, as to the documents, the money, and the money orders that were stolen by the Cirelli group from the Midway plane, we know from our man, Alex Batos, who infiltrated the work of the Cirelli mob, that those things were put on the market, the criminal underworld, shall we say, within 2 days after the crash. The Cirelli group was seeking to sell the Barker money, the $2 million in money orders in $100 denominations, and the Mitchell documents for upwards of $5 million. Shortly after the crash, we, in a public statement, described the Mitchell documents. We got almost instant corroboration, at least instantly from our standpoint. A federal employee known to us and known to our organization showed up at my home within 24 hours, and in a very sophisticated discussion, the upshot of which was that our organization was not well heeled, which is true, that we operate at home, which is true, and that we could use $100,000, which is also probably true. We did not sell our copy, nor would we at that point admit that we had a copy of the Mitchell documents. But we now challenge the government to prosecute us if they so wish, rather than to continue intimidating us. Because not only have they taken into custody and kept for 40 days our staff investigator without written charges, hearing, or a trial, but I and another member of our staff were suckered into a early morning meeting in a parking lot near my home to exchange supposedly documents about the Watergate. When we got there, we discovered that the two people that were there were FBI agents, at least we thought they were, and they told us that if we don't turn over the Mitchell documents or sell it to the government as we were asked, that we would go the way of Alex Batos, that we would be spirited away without petition, without written charge or trial, and end up in the federal prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri, just like Alex Batos. That we took to be a direct threat. Thereafter we split. We ended up 3.5 days later in Canada, after going up and down country roads to elude pursuers, and we made statements in Canada about what happened to us. Of course, our finances were not such that we could stay long in Canada as if it were a vacation. And so a few days later, on March 30th, we headed back across the Windsor-Detroit tunnel to the United States. On the way back, we tested the government. We had previously put some of the Mitchell documents on film, and at the border, coming back to the United States, we turned them over to the U.S. Customs and received a receipt as contraband, and the receipt describes the documents as having been stolen from the Midway Plane Flight 553, December 8, 1972. When we got back to Chicago, the U.S. Attorney here, James Thompson, said that he was acting as an intermediary for U.S. Customs and the FBI and attempted to deliver to us prints made from the film. We caught him with a fraud, and we threw the prints back in his face in a press conference on April 4th, 1973, on the 15th floor of the Federal Building. Thereafter, Thompson pursued a reporter who took away the prints that we left on the floor and very casually said that he'd like to have them back. But we have caught the government with a fraud. Our copy of the Mitchell documents we sent out of the Western Hemisphere. Please understand, we have known about the Mitchell documents since 1971, long before the Midway crash. The same documents were used by Congressman Daniel Rostenkowski of Chicago prior to the indictment of Otto Kerner. Rostenkowski tried to blackmail Mitchell while Mitchell was the Attorney General not to proceed with the Kerner indictment. It was about September of 1971. Thereafter, Justice and Treasury, using my friendship with the media, leaked a story through me. I suppose by hindsight I should not have allowed it, but they used me to leak a story showing Rostenkowski's ownership himself of racetrack stock, which in a way pushed his vehicle off the road and silenced him. Thereafter, the Mitchell documents went into limbo and were not seen again until they were stolen from the Midway plane December 8th, 72.
No one besides Skolnik and Barros witnessed the $100,000 bribery attempt by the FBI agent, and when Skolnik disappeared in Canada for 3 days, a police search was launched. But later, Skolnik showed up at a Windsor, Ontario motel, complete with luggage and an aide who chauffeurs him around. The Chicago U.S. Attorney's Office also reported receiving a call from a baffled customs officer. It seems that a Chicago man had pressed some documents into his hands, and the agent wanted to know what he should do with them. At this point, Chicago U.S. Attorney James R. Thompson got into the act by offering Skolnik amnesty if he would return home.
On or about April 11th, 1973, we received a call from the friend of the attorney of James McCord, the Watergate spy. His attorney is Bud Fensterwald, and we have known Fensterwald for 3 years. A friend of Fensterwald called us and said that they heard about our findings, facts, and so on, about the Midway crash being sabotage and murder. And they invited us to come to Washington to demonstrate these facts before some of the Watergate defendants. They told us that Mr. Liddy, one of the defendants, could not be turned around, but that those defendants that could be turned around and persuaded about this, that they would then challenge or attack the White House. The idea to us was intriguing, and so we went to Washington at our own expense in order not to be beholden to Fensterwald. In a lengthy discussion in Fensterwald's office at 927 15th Avenue Northwest, Washington, on the afternoon of April 16th, we got into a discussion of these facts. We discovered that we were in possession of a great amount more facts than they had. Now, step by step, McCord's testimony has been confirming what we already brought in our civil suit against the National Transportation Board Chairman, Isabel Burgess, which is a suit pending The federal government has yet to dispute our charges. But McCord's testimony before the grand jury that has been leaking out has been running parallel to our findings, namely that Mrs. Hunt was very instrumental in this, that she was the Watergate payoff woman, that she was the direct representative, spokesman, had direct authority from Nixon, and was offering some of the Watergate defendants executive clemency, and of the role of Mitchell that we have described and the espionage fund. What bothered us about this is that Fensterwald was very blatant. He said that we have Nixon more or less back to the wall, and that it seemed to us at that point that Fensterwald and McCord had more power than the president.
Bud Fensterwald denies ever having met with Skolnik in Washington, and there are no witnesses to corroborate the conversation that took place there. And predictably, it's at this point that Skolnik's theory gets very sketchy.
Now, we are not about to be apologists for Nixon. We are not one of his supporters, and we are not a supporter of Mitchell. But the problem is this. For several years now, Mr. Fensterwald has run a group that is not well publicized, but is well known in the field of a political assassination research. He runs a group at the address we described, 927 15th Avenue, Northwest Washington, called the Committee to Investigate Assassinations. Notice those initials, CIA. They are a gigantic documentary depository, a sort of giant filing cabinet for the entire field in the Western Hemisphere of people that dig up things about political assassination. The thing is that Fensterwald helps those like myself and others that are in this field. I'm one of some 200 researchers in that field of political assassination. As long as we go along with his theories, he helps us. Almost everybody that I know in the field is afraid of him. Why? He seems to have the access to secret documents, which when he releases it to us, we are able to confirm, but we must follow his theories. And I locked spears with him in a case against the National Archives 3 years ago involving the plot against President Kennedy and the false imprisonment of Abraham Bolden. Fensterwald seems to be the spokesman for the CIA group. Now, as to the implications of all that we have discussed on this tape, we believe, from talking to Fensterwald and talking to Hunt's attorney, Mr. Bittman, that some of the Watergate defendants are double agents. In fact, Mr. Bittman and Mr. Fensterwald joked about it and readily admitted that they know that to be so. Now, there was no real excuse, no real reason to break into the Watergate complex. There was no real secrets there. There might have been reason to tap the phones of a candidate's office, but not the National Committee's office of the Democratic Party. We believe that some of the defendants wanted to be caught there. They wanted to accent part of Nixon's nature. And I think it is no dispute that Nixon's nature is to seek and obtain power by way of political espionage, deception, and fraud. For example, Nixon first got into office in 1946 as a congressman, running against an alleged communist by the name of Jerry Voorhees, an incumbent congressman in California. It has not been brought to the public's attention, so far as I know, that Jerry Voorhees is identified in a book, Who's Who in the CIA, a book banned in this country, that he is in charge, has been in charge of CIA subversion in Latin America. So this isn't the first time that Nixon used deception, political espionage, and fraud. He used it in 1962 when he ran unsuccessfully for governor, and governor of California, and some of that has come out recently. So what the Watergate defendants did was they suckered Nixon into a plan which they led him to believe was his plan, and they accented the political espionage that he already favors. what the Midway crash shows, that there was murder and sabotage involved in the same thing. Now, when President Jack Kennedy criticized the CIA, said he was going to splinter them and scatter them to the winds because of the Bay of Pigs fiasco in the early 60s, they were pledged, really, to punish him. Another book banned in this country, which was a bestseller in Europe, called Farewell America. The book Farewell America points out the CIA's role with the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, we are living in a more sophisticated time. The CIA tried to take over the presidency with the assassination of Kennedy. What they are now doing through the Watergate defendants is they are trying to take over and destroy the office of presidency so that the country could be ruled by martial law and by a committee. In other words, they are destroying the idea of constitutional government in this country. Now, we are not for a moment saying that Nixon and Mitchell and the others are not guilty. What we are saying is that there's another faction involved more diabolical than Nixon. On April 17, 1973, while we were in Washington, I myself hand-delivered for Mr. Hunt to the that's E. Howard Hunt, to the superintendent of the District of Columbia Jail, a letter which was delivered to him, setting forth a summary of these facts and calling upon Hunt as follows. I say, Mr. Hunt, I cannot bear to believe that you are a party to these crimes. I ask that you request the jail warden to permit me to visit you so that I can tell you directly the foregoing in detail. Well, the word I got back the next day from his attorney, Mr. William O. Bittman, 815 Connecticut Avenue, Northwest, Washington, was that I should take it up with another one of Hunt's lawyers in Chicago named John Hayes. The point is that Mr. Hunt is probably, with Fensterwald, one of the most important people in our government. He probably is the true head of the Central Intelligence Agency and not Mr. Robert Schlesinger. The letter informs Mr. Hunt that his wife has been murdered and the plane on which she was sabotaged. And we call upon him to cooperate with us. As of this date, we believe that he is not going to do anything about it and that he himself in some way is implicated because he bought $250,000 of insurance just before he put her on the plane. As we described in our lawsuit now pending, Mrs. Hunt was on the way to Chicago not to buy a motel, which was a cover story, but to seek counsel of a very high-priced lawyer in Chicago. Now, understand something. Hunt and his wife are what is known as a CIA couple, both working for the CIA. Before they could get married, they needed the agency permission. The agency does not permit a divorce because in the process of a divorce, some of the dirty linen is dragged out, which would involve the CIA. She did, however, express to McCord that she was unhappy with her role as the Watergate payoff woman. She was seeking a legal way out, and that was the reason she traveled to Chicago. That is now confirmed by McCord's federal grand jury testimony. The CIA has been planning to take over this country and rule by committee and by martial law for some time. There's a book coming out soon called The Glass House Tapes, which points out how they planned to take over by martial law and how one of their people, Louis Tackwood, confessed on October 1971 that were the GOP convention to be in San Diego, of course they moved it to Miami Beach, but were to be in San Diego, that there was a plan to bomb the place, blame it on radical hippie freaks, and thereafter have the president or someone else declare martial law and a national emergency and take over the country. There is a whole background of violence paid for by the CIA faction, or that which is known as the CIA in this government. And by the way, the CIA is super parliamentary. They neither come or go by way of any election. The CIA has instigated a portion of the violence in this country to be blamed on the so-called left wing.
Assuming that you can keep all of this straight, a number of obvious questions and discrepancies come to mind. Could all of these people possibly have been on the same plane because they were in some way implicated in the Watergate conspiracy? Who are the anonymous FAA employees and the toxicologist who gave Skolnik the information? Who's telling the truth about the coroner's report? According to the report, there were no traces of cyanide in either Dorothy Hunt's or Michelle Clark's body. Was Michelle Clark of CBS News really going to break a story on Mrs. Hunt? According to Bill Small, CBS Washington bureau chief, Ms. Clark was anchoring the morning news in Washington and flew home to Chicago frequently to see her family. As early as December, Small says, she probably didn't even know who Mrs. Hunt was. And a United lawyer, Richard Street, who testified at the Safety Board hearing, said that Miss Clark's body was cremated 3 days after the crash at the request of her parents, not immediately after on the order of CBS. I spoke with Sherman Skolnik several months ago in New York City in an attempt to get an answer to some of these questions.
This toxicologist is a very distinguished person, and he works in a hospital that is federally funded. Were I to give you the name, his entire project would suddenly lose their budget, and how would I justify that? In other words, I'm not being evasive. I'm telling you the nature of the problem. So I am fearful what the government is going to do in the Watergate case to silence my witnesses and my the expert testimony of people I'm going to offer.
What indication do you have that some of the men, the Watergate defendants in Bud Fensterwall's office in Washington, the time that you met them in April, are double agents or agents?
I had a lengthy discussion with McCord's attorney, Bud Fensterwall. I happen to know him for the last 3 years. And he wanted to use our information for their purpose. He wanted to push us out of the picture, and I understand his reasons. In discussing this matter with him, he in a way laughed. He says, well, we know that some of the Watergate people are double agents. Mr. Bittman, Hunt's attorney, Mr. E. Howard Hunt, I spent an hour and a half with him on April 18th in his office in Washington, and he likewise said the same thing, that he recognized that one or more of the defendants are double agents and wanted to be caught there.
You also indicated that money parachuted from Flight 553, the $2 million, I assume you meant.
And if I supplied the name of the eyewitness, she would suddenly be found dead by falling down an elevator shaft or some other mystery happening to her. Look, we're well aware what happened to the witnesses in the investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy.
You indicated also that former Attorney General John Mitchell owned a large amount of stock in El Paso Natural Gas. There was no indication that he was given that stock as opposed to buying it, was there?
Well, he got it by way of a nominee, a law partner of his, just about the time that the Justice Department, under his supervision in 1969, was nice enough to drop $300 million worth of antitrust charges.
Do you have any indication of these stock transfers? Do you have them?
We do. We have the records, and we challenge the government to prosecute us because we say that these records were stolen from Flight 553. The government has been hassling us behind the scenes but does not want to prosecute us because it would validate what we charge.
While you allege to have all this evidence, you refuse to reveal your informants, which makes it impossible for the press to prove.
Well, one of our informants is now well known. He's sitting right nearby here, and you can interview him.
But he's a member of your own staff.
Well, that way I can be certain of what is the nature of the problem.
Skolnik was denied the chance to testify at the February National Transportation Safety Board hearing because he refused to document any of his allegations. He subsequently filed suit against Isabel Burgess, chairwoman of the board, and on June 13th she relented, allowing Skolnik to testify during the second session of the hearing, provided he rely on the facts. But through an hour of testimony, the man who had so often accused the press and the safety board of covering up the conspiracy did not supply any new factual material, only his interpretation of the hearing record. The next day, on June 14th at 5:30 p.m., Chairwoman Burgess announced that the board would recess indefinitely, and Sherman Skolnik was right back where he started.
Hotline News presented 24 hours today by the Citizens Committee to Clean Up the Courts. Sherman Skolnik, Chairman. Recently, they briefly mentioned the name of Henry Crown in some crooked land deals with Tom Keene. You may not know it, but Henry Crown is a sacred cow. The news media dare not mention him in a negative manner. Henry Crown owns so many corporations, he is in a position to hassle the news media with cutbacks in advertising. The press will never mention much about the dishonest airplane contract, the TFX, involving General Dynamics, in which Crown is the major shareholder. The plane is so rotten, they had to finally stop making it. The book Captive City, by the way, was censored. Major sections about Henry Crown were removed before publication. Remember all this next time you see Henry Crown's yellow and red cement truck.
Like many other conspiracy theories, this one seems to blend fact with coincidence and conjecture, relying heavily on what could conceivably have taken place as opposed to what really did take place. Still, we are left with the undeniable fact of 50 FBI agents at the scene of the crash, as well as 3 Nixon administration officials who were transferred to key FAA, United Airlines, and National Transportation Safety Board positions immediately after the crash. But even if the American public will no longer swallow Watergate as what one presidential spokesman once described as a third-rate burglary attempt, it remains to be seen if it will accept the CIA murder-sabotage theory any more readily than it did with the alleged CIA conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. This report was compiled from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Village Voice, the New York Post, the Rolling Stone, Zodiac News Service, and interviews with Sherman Skolnik. I'm Jan Lignito.
You're listening to KPFA and KPFB in Berkeley.